Dawn in October, white fog crawling across 11 acres of untended land. A cart rolls up the lane, no machine, no engine, just 2 horses breathing smoke into the cold, and a man who won't look the woman at the fence in the eye. The pin comes loose. The apples come down like a landslide. Bruised skins. Split flesh. That smell, sweet and sour at once, the kind that clings to a coat for a week, rising into the morning air. The woman doesn't step back. She folds her arms. Holds her breath. 3 miles down the county road, in town, they've already started talking. That she's lost her mind. That she begged a man to dump his rot on her land. Nobody asks why. But somewhere, behind a board gone soft in a pantry wall, a rusted tin box has been waiting 30 years. And out there, the pile grows taller every Tuesday. The first cart came at dawn. Not a machine. Not an engine. Just 2 horses breathing fog into the October cold, and a farmhand named Otis, who never once looked Cora Bennett in the eye, when he pulled the pin on the tailgate. The apples came down like a landslide. Bruised skins. Split flesh. A smell already halfway to rot, sweet and sour at once, the kind of smell that clung to a coat for a week if you stood too close. Cora didn't stand too close. Not that first morning. She stood at the fence line, with her arms crossed and her breath held, watching a year of her life get decided by a man who hadn't yet bothered to learn her name. Because that's what this was. A decision. Already made. She just didn't know it yet. 3 miles down the county road, if you asked anyone in Thistledown, they'd tell you the same thing. Bennett girl's lost her mind. That's what they called her. The Bennett girl. 24 years old. A widow. A mother. And now, apparently, a madwoman who'd begged a produce manager to dump his rotting fruit on her land for free. They said it at the general store. They said it at church. They said it loud enough that it always found its way back to her, the way gossip does in a town small enough to fit inside one held breath. Cora heard all of it. She just didn't have the time to care. A year earlier, none of this existed. Not the farm. Not the apples. Not the fear that lived behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. She'd been a seamstress then. A good one. Steady hands, quiet mouth, the kind of woman who could turn a torn hem into something you'd never notice had been torn at all. She had a small room above Whitfield's dry goods, one window facing east, and a daughter asleep in the bed beside her most nights, because there was only one bed, and there had only ever needed to be one. Her husband, Daniel, had been dead 2 winters by then. Typhoid took him in 11 days. 11 days from the first fever to the last breath, and Cora had counted every one of them, because counting was the only thing that kept her upright. Because if she stopped counting she'd have had to feel it. And feeling it back then felt like something that might kill her too. It didn't. She didn't let it. She had a daughter. Ivy. 3 years old, when Daniel died, small enough she didn't understand the word gone, old enough to ask for her father every night for a month afterward in that flat, patient toddler voice that broke something in Cora each time it happened. Cora never told her to stop asking. She just learned how to answer, without her own voice shaking. Took her almost a year to manage it clean. So, that was the life. A room above a shop. A needle and thread. A daughter slowly forgetting the sound of a father's voice, and a mother too tired most nights to grieve him properly herself. Not a bad life. Not one anyone would pity out loud. But small. God, it was small. Some nights Cora lay awake listening to Ivy breathe, and thought, this is it. This room. This window. This is the whole shape of what's left. She never said that thought to anyone. Until the letter came. The letter was from a lawyer in Thistledown, a careful, thin-lipped man named Mr. Abernathy, and it said 3 things in 3 short lines. Your grandmother has passed. There is a matter of an estate. Please come at your earliest convenience. Cora read it twice standing in the doorway of Whitfield's. Then a third time, sitting down, because the second reading hadn't made it any more real than the first. Hester Vance. Dead. She hadn't seen her grandmother in 4 years. Not out of anger. Just distance. The kind that creeps in quiet, a visit missed here, a letter unanswered there, until one day you look up, and 4 years have gone, and you can't name a single reason why. Cora packed a bag that night. Ivy on her hip, 5 years old now, heavy in the way children get right, before they stop wanting to be carried at all. She didn't cry on the coach ride out. Not because she didn't feel it. Because she was too busy bracing for whatever came next. Which, as it turned out, was the right instinct. The reading happened in Mr. Abernathy's office, a narrow room smelling of pipe smoke, and old paper, one window looking out on the main road, a portrait of somebody's dead relative glaring down from the wall. Cora sat with Ivy asleep against her shoulder. Abernathy sat across from her with a folder he kept opening and closing, like he hadn't decided whether he wanted to be the one holding it. "Your grandmother left you the farm," he said. 11 acres. House. Barn. The orchard rose. Cora nodded. That much she'd expected. "There's also," he said, and here he cleared his throat, "a matter of the mortgage." Cora went still. "A mortgage? Your grandmother took a loan against the property some years back. Improvements? A bad season? I don't know the full history. What I know is the balance. And the terms. Which are 14 months, Abernathy said. From today. Payable in full by October the 14th, next year, or the note reverts to the bank. Silence. The kind with weight. The kind that presses on your chest until you remember to breathe. 14 months, Cora repeated. Like saying it twice might change the number. It didn't. "I'm sorry," Abernathy said, and he did sound sorry, in the flat, practiced way of a man who'd said those 2 words to a lot of grieving people in a lot of narrow offices. "I know this isn't what you were hoping to hear." Cora looked down at Ivy, still asleep, still innocent of everything that had just happened in this room. 11 acres. A house. A barn. And a debt that could take it all, before her daughter turned 7. "What happens," she asked slowly, "if I can't pay it?" "The bank forecloses. Auctions the land. You'd have no claim on it whatsoever." No claim. 2 words, and just like that, the only inheritance her family had left, the only thing standing between her and that small room above Whitfield's for the rest of her life, had a clock strapped to it. 14 months. She'd count them. God help her, she already knew she would. Because counting was the only thing that had ever kept her upright, and this felt exactly like Daniel's fever all over again. 11 days, then. 14 months, now. Except this time nobody was going to die at the end of it. Not if she had anything to say about it. The farm itself, when she finally saw it in mid-August light, told its own kind of story. Wild grass had swallowed the orchard rows entirely, tall enough to hide a person, if they crouched. The porch sagged on one side like a man leaning on a wall he no longer trusted to hold him. Inside the barn, the old cider press sat frozen, with rust, cobwebs strung between its beams like something out of a ghost story. Cora walked through it all, with Ivy's hand in hers, and Ivy, 5 years old, unbothered by mortgages, or deadlines or any adult weather pressing on her mother's shoulders, pointed at a bird's nest tucked in the rafters and laughed. "Look, Mama! A house for a house." Cora almost broke, right there. Almost let the whole 14 months crack her open in front of her own daughter. She didn't. She squeezed Ivy's hand instead. "Yes," she said. "A house for a house." And she thought, not for the last time, "I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how. But I am going to do this." Because there was no version of this, where she let Ivy grow up watching her mother lose the one thing left of Hester Vance. Not without a fight. Not without trying every single thing she could think of first. The problem was, she couldn't think of anything yet. They moved in within the week. 4 boxes of clothes. A trunk of Daniel's old things she hadn't been able to leave behind, and hadn't been able to open either. A fear that sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed whole. 14 months. Minus 1 week already. 13 months, 3 weeks, and however many days. She started counting again. She fixed the porch first, because a porch that might collapse under a 5-year-old felt more urgent than a debt, with over a year on the clock. She patched the roof where it leaked. She cleared the worst of the grass around the house, though the orchard rows stayed wild, because clearing 11 acres by hand, one pair of hands, one small child underfoot, was not a thing that could happen in a week. Or a month. Possibly ever. Money was the real wall. Not the mortgage, not yet. The mortgage was a future problem, a 14-month problem. The immediate problem was smaller and meaner. Food. Coal for winter. Whatever Ivy needed, that Cora couldn't sew, or grow or barter for. She still had her needle. She still had steady hands. She took in mending, from the few thistledown families willing to send work 3 miles out to a farm nobody expected to stay occupied come spring. It helped. It wasn't enough. She lay awake some nights doing the arithmetic, over and over, the same numbers refusing to add up no matter how many times she rearranged them. Sowing money here. Garden vegetables there. A debt the size of a small mountain sitting at the far end of it, waiting. There has to be something else, she'd think. There has to be some other way through this. And then she'd fall asleep, before the thought finished, too tired to chase it further. Which was exactly where things stood the October morning Silas Price rode up the lane. She heard the horse, before she saw the rider. Heard it slow at the gate, heard the creak of a saddle, heard boots hit dirt, with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd walked onto 100 farms just like this one, and expected to walk onto 100 more. Cora came out on the porch, wiping flour from her hands, Ivy peeking out from behind her skirt. The man at the gate was maybe 50. Weathered face, the kind carved by decades of sun and worry in equal measure. He held his hat against his chest like it was a habit older than his manners. Mrs. Bennett. Silas Price. I manage the orchard operation out at Thackeray. I know who you are, Mr. Price. She didn't. Not really. Just the name, in passing, the way you know the names of things at the edge of your life. What can I do for you? He glanced past her, at 11 acres stretching out behind the house. Empty. Overgrown. Untouched. I've got a proposal. Might sound strange. Strange is about all I've got room for these days, Mr. Price. Go on. Every season, he said, Thackeray pulls fruit that doesn't make it to market. Bruised. Split. Hail struck. We haul it 2 counties, over to a composting operation. Costs us in diesel, and time and tipping fees, that climb steeper every year. And you're telling me this because you've got 11 empty acres, and I've got a mountain of apples nobody wants. He said it plain, no dressing on it. I'll bring you every load, free of charge. Dump it on your back acreage instead of hauling it off. Saves me the trip. Saves me the fees. Cora felt something in her chest lift, just slightly, before her mind caught up, and started asking questions her instincts hadn't gotten to yet. What's it cost me? She said. Nothing. Silas shrugged. Land, mostly. And whatever smell you're willing to tolerate. That's it. That's it. Behind her skirt, Ivy tugged at Cora's dress. Mama. Can we keep them? They're apples, sweetheart. Not puppies. Can we keep them anyway? Cora almost laughed. First time in weeks. She looked back at Silas Price, standing there with his hat against his chest, and his offer laid out plain, as the dirt beneath his boots, and she thought about 13 months, minus however many weeks, and a debt that wasn't shrinking no matter how hard she sewed. She thought about a grandmother's voice, faint now, worn soft by years of not being heard. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. People decided that. Nature never did. She didn't have a plan yet. Not a real one. Just a hollow, aching space where a plan should have been, and a stranger at her gate offering to fill it with something. Anything. Send them, Cora said. As many as you've got. Silas actually blinked, like he hadn't expected the yes to come, that fast, that clean, with no haggling in between. Most folks want money for the privilege, he said slowly. Or they turn me down flat. Don't want the wasps. Don't want the smell. I'm not most folks, Mr. Price. No, he said, looking at her a beat longer than the conversation strictly required. I don't suppose you are. He was back the following Tuesday. 2 carts, not one, Otis at the reins of the second, and from that morning forward it became a rhythm, as fixed as sunrise. Every Tuesday. The gate already open, because nobody bothered to lock it anymore. The apples spilling behind the barn in a slow, thudding avalanche that grew a little taller each week. Word moved through Thistledown the way it always did, fast and mean, and mostly wrong. Cora heard it secondhand, the way you hear most things about yourself in a small town. Her uncle rode out special to ask if she'd lost her senses. A woman from church cornered her outside Whitfield's, voice pitched for sympathy, and landing somewhere closer to pity, asking whether Cora had thought this through, a widow alone, with a child, filling her land with rot. Somebody left a note pinned to her gate. Smells like a graveyard out here. Nothing else. Cora read it once. Folded it. Fed it to the stove. She kept showing up every Tuesday morning anyway. The pile grew. October gave way to a colder, grayer edge of November, and the mound behind the barn had climbed to the height of a man standing on another man's shoulders. Wasps in the daytime. A smell that hung heavy on still mornings, sweet rot layered, overchurned earth. Wagons started slowing near her fenced line out of pure gawking curiosity. Cora watched them from the porch some afternoons. One neighbor, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who farmed the plot 2 lanes over, pulled up to her fence one gray Thursday, and called out, half laughing, "You planning on burying something under there, Mrs. Bennett?" Cora, elbow deep in laundry water, didn't even look up. "Just my patience, Mr. Pruitt. Little at a time." He laughed. Rode on. Told the story at the general store, that evening, and by Sunday half of Thistledown had heard some version of it, most of them stripping the joke out, and keeping only the part where the Bennett girl was clearly, obviously, not right in the head. Cora didn't care what they thought. She told herself that every night. Some nights it was even true. She hadn't figured out what to do with the apples yet. Not really. She had the shape of an idea, something her grandmother used to do, something about not letting a bruised apple go to waste if there was flesh left worth saving, but a shape wasn't a plan, and a plan was what she needed, with 13 months and shrinking. So she went into town for supplies. Salt. Flour. Muslin for a mending job. And because the list was already long, a bottle of vinegar, because hers had run dry, and a household, without vinegar couldn't pickle, couldn't clean, couldn't do half the things a household needed doing. Which was how she ended up standing in Bartholomew Crane's general store on a cold afternoon, Ivy's hand in hers, staring up at a shelf of imported vinegar bottles, with prices that made her stomach turn. "Something I can help you find, Mrs. Bennett?" Crane's voice arrived before Crane did. He came around the counter slow, unhurried, a heavy-set man in a waistcoat too fine for a general store in a town this size, a smile that never quite reached anywhere near his eyes. "Just vinegar, Mr. Crane." "Ah." He glanced at the shelf. "The French or the domestic?" "Whichever's cheaper." "They're both dear this season. Shipping costs, you understand? Everything comes from somewhere, Mrs. Bennett. Nothing simply appears." There was something in the way he said it. A small, deliberate weight on the word appears, like he already knew exactly what had been piling up behind her barn, and found the whole business faintly, privately amusing. "I understand plenty about where things come from, Mr. Crane." "Do you?" He picked up the domestic bottle himself, turning it in his hand like he was appraising it. "Or her. I hear you've taken up quite the collection out at the old Vance place." "Apples, is it?" "Whole mountain of them, from what Silas Price is telling anyone who'll listen. They're not doing any harm." "No," Crane agreed, setting the bottle down. Rot rarely does. Until it does. Cora felt her jaw tighten. Ivy, sensing something in the air she was too young to name, pressed closer to her mother's skirt. Is there a point to this, Mr. Crane, or were you simply working up to one? He smiled wider. Still nothing behind it. No point at all. Just conversation. He wrapped the vinegar in brown paper, slow, a man with nowhere else he needed to be. I only mean to say, this town has a rhythm to it. People know what to expect from one another. The store sells vinegar. The mill sells flour. Everyone keeps to their trade, and everyone gets along fine. He set the wrapped bottle on the counter between them. It's when people start reaching outside their trade that things tend to get complicated. I wasn't aware raising apples on my own land counted as reaching for anything, Mr. Crane. No, he said. I don't suppose it does. Not yet. He said it lightly. Almost kindly, if you didn't listen too closely. Cora paid. Took Ivy's hand. Walked out into the cold, without another word, because some men weren't worth the breath it took to answer them. But the words followed her anyway, out the door, down the road, all 13 months, and however many weeks of them. Not yet. That night, after Ivy was asleep, Cora sat at the kitchen table, with a candle burning low, and did the thing she'd been putting off since the day she moved in. She went looking for her grandmother. Not the grave, she'd visited that already, standing at the small stone marker out past the orchard rows, with nothing much to say. She went looking for the parts of Hester Vance still scattered through the house. A shawl on a hook by the door. A row of chipped mixing bowls in the pantry. A recipe box, its cards gone soft and brown at the edges, half of them in handwriting Cora recognized instantly, the same careful, slanted script that used to sign her birthday letters. Tucked near the bottom of the box, a card that wasn't a recipe at all. Just one line, written in pencil, faded almost past reading. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. Cora sat very still, candle guttering, the whole cold house silent around her. She was 8 years old the first time she heard those words, standing at her grandmother's elbow in a farmer's market crowd, watching Hester Vance dig through the ugly bin, the bruised bin, the too scarred to sell bin, buying the whole sorry lot for almost nothing, while Cora tugged her sleeve and asked, in the plain, blunt way of children, why she didn't just buy the nice apples like everyone else. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. People decided that. Nature never did. She hadn't thought about that sentence in over a decade. It surfaced now, whole and intact, like something waiting patiently under the surface for exactly this moment. She thought about the mountain behind the barn. Rotting. Growing. A joke to half of thistledown. A nuisance to Bartholomew Crane. A mystery to everyone driving slow past her fence line. She thought about 14 months. Now closer to 13. And she thought, clearly, without any of the fear she'd been carrying, since Abernathy's narrow office. What if the apples aren't the problem? What if the apples are the only thing in this whole mess that isn't? She didn't know yet what that meant. Didn't know what she'd actually do, with a mountain of rotting fruit beyond what her grandmother had done, with a single bruised bin at a Tuesday market. But it was something. A thread. The first one she'd had to pull since the whole nightmare started. She picked up the pencil beside the recipe box, her grandmother's, worn to a stub, and on the back of an old grocery list started writing. Not a plan yet. Just questions. What do you do with fruit that's already rotting? What lasts? What sells? What doesn't need to look pretty to be worth something? She wrote until the candle burned almost to nothing, Ivy's slow breathing drifting from the next room, the mountain sitting silent and patient under a cold November sky. The following Tuesday, when Silas's carts rolled up the lane, and the apples came spilling down in their usual thudding avalanche, Cora was already waiting at the fence. Not with her arms crossed this time. With a bucket in each hand. Silas noticed. Pulled his horses up short, studying her the way a man studies weather about to change on him. Something different today, Mrs. Bennett? Maybe. She set the buckets down, started walking the pile, eyes moving with a focus she hadn't shown it before. Tell me something, Mr. Price. If I can. Why does Thackeray have this much rejected fruit? Every week. Seems an awful lot for one orchard to be tossing away. Something crossed his face. Quick. Gone almost before it landed. But Cora had spent 2 years watching Daniel's face for the small signs. That told her more than his words did, and she caught it anyway. Been a hard season, Silas said. Careful. Too careful. Hard how? He looked past her, toward the mound, toward the 11 acres beyond it, weighing something. You planning something with all this? Might be. Then maybe, he said slowly, it's time we had a longer conversation than a Tuesday morning at your fence line allows. They talked on the porch, Ivy inside with a rag doll, and a fire built higher than Cora could really afford. Silas told her the truth in pieces, the way men do, when the truth doesn't flatter them. Thackeray had blight. Not the kind that killed a tree outright, the kind that crept, slow and mean, through certain rows, turning fruit soft, and split at a rate the orchard hadn't seen in a decade. The tipping fees 2 counties over had climbed twice already that year. The owners were asking questions Silas didn't have comfortable answers for. Truth is, he said, looking at the county road instead of at her, I came to you, because you were the only landowner, within 10 miles, who didn't ask me for money, or run me off her property. Not because I thought you had some grand plan. Because I was desperate, and you were kind, and those 2 things lined up at the right moment. You could have told me that from the start, Cora said. Could have. Didn't think it would help my case much. A man showing up begging instead of offering. I'd have said yes either way, Mr. Price. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he hadn't at the gate, that first Tuesday. I'm starting to believe that. She told him, that afternoon, the beginnings of what she was thinking. Vinegar. Not applesauce, not dried rings on a string. Something with a shelf life, something that didn't care one bit whether the apple that made it had been pretty to begin with. Something Bartholomew Crane sold on his shelf for more than a farmhand made in a week, wrapped in brown paper, shipped in from somewhere else, because everything, according to him, came from somewhere else. Not anymore, Cora thought. Silas listened. Didn't laugh, didn't scoff. I can set aside the tart drops, he said. Older trees. Sharper fruit. If it's fermentation you're after, that's likely your better stock. Though I won't pretend to know the first thing about how you'd go about it. Neither do I, Cora admitted. Not yet. But you're going to find out. It wasn't a question. Cora looked at him a long moment, out at the mountain, at the county road, where curious strangers still slowed to stare, at the whole absurd, impossible shape of what she was about to attempt, with no money, no experience, and 13 months standing between her, and losing everything her grandmother had left behind. I'm going to find out, she said. That night, after Silas rode off, and Ivy had finally fallen asleep, Cora sat again at the kitchen table, with her grandmother's pencil, and the back of an old grocery list, and this time the question started turning into something else. Something that looked, if you squinted, almost like a plan. Crush the fruit. Let it sit. Let something happen that isn't rot, something else, something that turns rot into use instead of waste. She didn't know the chemistry of it. Didn't know the word fermentation meant anything more to her than a vague memory of her grandmother's kitchen smelling sharp and strange some autumns, barrels covered in cloth instead of lids, a process Cora had been too young and too incurious to ever ask about directly. You're gone, she thought, staring at the pencil stub in her hand, at the faded card that said the fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. You're gone and you took the how of it with you, and all I've got left is the why. It would have to be enough. The why, at least, was hers now. Fully. No one could take that part away. Not the bank. Not Bartholomew Crane, with his brown paper, and his talk of people reaching outside their trade. Let him talk. Cora Bennett had 11 acres, a mountain of rejected apples growing taller by the Tuesday, 13 months on a clock, that didn't care whether she was ready, and a 5-year-old daughter asleep down the hall, who deserved better than a room above Whitfield's for the rest of her childhood. She didn't have a recipe. She didn't have experience. She had a barn, with a rusted cider press that hadn't turned in years, a grandmother's sentence written on a soft brown card, and a stubbornness that had gotten her through 11 days of Daniel's fever, and 2 years of grief afterward, and every single Tuesday, since the apples first started arriving, whether Thistledown liked it or not. It would have to be enough to start. She blew out the candle, sat a moment in the dark, listening to the old house settle, to the wind moving through the wild orchard rows outside, to whatever remained, in that quiet, of Hester Vance's long-worn kitchen. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow I go find that press and see if it still turns. Outside, past the fence line, the mountain sat waiting. Taller than a man now. Taller than the joke it had started as. It didn't know it was supposed to be worth less. Nobody had told it that yet. And come morning, neither would Cora. The cider press hadn't turned in years. Cora found that out the hard way. She hauled the crank, with both hands the first morning, boots braced against the barn floor, and nothing happened. Nothing. Just rust and resistance, and her own breath fogging out in front of her like proof she was trying at all. So she oiled it. Waited a day. Tried again. It groaned. Then it turned. A small victory. She'd take it. Batch 1 was a disaster. She knew that going in, or told herself she knew it, which wasn't quite the same as being braced for how bad it got. She crushed maybe 300 pounds that first week. Hauled the pulp into a row of old buckets she'd scrubbed, as clean as her hands could manage. Covered them. Waited. Because that's what you did with fermentation. You waited. Her grandmother had waited. Nature did the rest. Except nature didn't care whether Cora Bennett understood the difference between clean and clean enough. 10 days in, she pulled the cloth back off the first bucket, and nearly dropped it. Gray film. Thick. Furred, almost spreading across the surface like something that had crawled there and died. Under it, a smell so sharp it hit the back of her throat, before her eyes finished adjusting to what she was looking at. She stumbled backward, out the barn door, into the cold, and stood there a full minute just breathing air that didn't want to make her sick. Mold, she thought. That's not vinegar. That's not anything. That's just rot winning. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself, somewhere around the 4th day of Daniel's fever, that she was done crying over things she could still fix. This felt fixable. Barely. But fixable. She scrubbed the buckets raw that afternoon. Started over. Batch 2 went further, before it failed, which felt like progress in the moment. It wasn't. It was just a slower kind of failure dressed up to look like something better. She'd learned, from a pamphlet Abernathy's clerk dug up for her, half out of pity, and half out of genuine curiosity, that wild yeast already lived on apple skins. That if she left crushed fruit alone in a clean container, covered loose, that yeast would start the work on its own. No mold this time. Instead, fizzing. Cloudiness. A smell that shifted day by day, from rot into something sharper. For 2 weeks it worked. Then it stopped. Just stopped. Sat there. Alcohol, thin and sour, refusing to become anything else no matter how long she left it. She didn't understand why, until she found Silas at the fence the following Tuesday, and admitted, reluctantly, that she'd sealed the containers tight. Because tight felt safer. Because loose felt like inviting something in. Silas winced. "You'll want air in there," he said. "Whatever's supposed to happen next needs air to happen at all." Air. Air. "I sealed them, because I was afraid of what would get in. And instead you kept out the one thing that mattered." She laughed, short and disbelieving, standing there in the cold, with rejected apples spilling out behind her, and a mortgage clock ticking somewhere she couldn't see, but could feel anyway, every hour, like a second pulse. "Story of my life, Mr. Price," she said. Batch 3 turned. Properly this time, cloth instead of lids, air where air needed to be. And then, because the universe wasn't finished teaching her lessons the hard way, it exploded. Not a real explosion. Just pressure, building quiet inside a jug she'd forgotten to loosen, and at 11 o'clock one night, in a barn lit by a single flickering lantern, the cap blew clean off, and cracked against the far wall loud enough to stop her heart. Cora screamed. Dropped the lantern. Grabbed for it, before the flame could catch anything, and stood there afterward, hands shaking, heart going like a rabbit's, staring at a jug of half-finished vinegar hissing in the dark like it had personally been trying to kill her. Ivy, asleep in the house, never woke. Cora sat down on an overturned bucket. Put her head in her hands. This is insane, she thought. Genuinely insane. I am a widow, with a 5-year-old daughter, and 12 months, and I am out here in the dark getting nearly brained by exploding apple juice. She almost laughed again. The kind of laugh that's one wrong breath away from something else entirely. She didn't let it tip that way. Picked the lantern back up. Cleaned the mess. Went to bed, with her hands still faintly trembling, and got up the next morning, and did it again anyway. Because what else was there? There wasn't anything else. There was this, or there was losing everything, and Cora had already decided, somewhere around batch 1, which of those two she could live with. Batch 4 turned to Vinegar. Technically did a lot of work in that sentence. It came out cloudy. Sharp in the wrong ways, jug to jug, some thinner, some almost undrinkable, no rhyme to any of it no matter how many times she turned the batches over in her head at night. She'd been mixing apples, without thinking, different weeks, different sugar, different stages of rot, all crushed together, because sorting felt like a luxury she didn't have time for. Which, as it turned out, was exactly the problem. A farm doesn't run on shortcuts. Fermentation, she was learning, punished exactly the kind of corner cutting that came naturally to a woman running out of both time and patience. She sat at the kitchen table one night in late November, ledger of failed batches spread in front of her, and put her face in her hands. 4 batches. 4 failures. Different flavors of failure, but failure all the same. 12 months left. Give or take. I don't know what I'm doing, she said out loud, to the empty kitchen, to nobody. I genuinely do not know what I am doing. The empty kitchen didn't answer. She found Ezra Marsh the way most people in Thistledown found each other. Sideways. By accident. Through somebody who knew somebody. It happened at the Saturday market, a smaller, colder affair in late November than it would have been in high summer. Cora had come for salt and thread and left, with neither, because she'd spent the better part of an hour cornering strangers, with the same increasingly desperate question. Do you know anything about vinegar? About fermenting? Anyone who might. Most just shook their heads and moved on, faces arranged into the particular blend of pity and amusement Cora had grown used to. One woman, a stallholder selling dried herbs, older, sharp-eyed, paused. Marsh, she said. Who? Ezra Marsh. Lives out past the mill, other side of the creek. Used to make wine years back, before, she stopped, waved a hand like the rest wasn't worth finishing. Keeps to himself mostly. But he'd know. If anyone in this county knows, it's him. Would he talk to me? The woman looked Cora over, slow, assessing. Depends, she said, on whether you're willing to sit through a man who hasn't had much reason to talk to anybody in a long while. Cora rode out 3 days later, Ivy staying behind, with a neighbor, a widow herself, one of the few in Thistledown who never once looked at Cora like something to be pitied, or laughed at. Ezra's place sat at the edge of the woods, small and quiet, smoke curling thin, from a chimney that looked like it hadn't seen much company in a long time. Cora knocked. Waited. Knocked again. The door opened on a man somewhere past 60, gray through the beard, eyes sharper than his slow, careful movements suggested. You're the Bennett woman, he said. Not a question. I am. The one with the apple pile. That's the one. He looked at her a long moment. Long enough that Cora almost turned around, and rode back the way she'd come. Then he stepped back from the door. "Might as well come in," he said. "You've clearly got questions, and I've clearly got nothing better to do with my afternoon than answer them badly." His kitchen table was worn smooth with age. A pot of something simmered low on the stove, filling the room with onions and thyme. Ezra sat across from her, hands folded, and let Cora talk 10 minutes before he said a word. When she finished, Batch 1, Batch 2, the mold, the seal, the explosion, Batch 4's cloudy inconsistency, he sat quiet a moment longer, sorting the whole mess into piles in his mind. "You're doing everything at once," he said finally. "And you're doing none of it slow enough to learn from it." "I don't have slow, Mr. Marsh. I have 12 months. Something flickered across his face. Curiosity, maybe? Or recognition. 12 months for what? Cora hesitated, then told him. The mortgage. The bank. The clock she carried around in her chest, ticking louder some days than others. Ezra listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet again, longer this time. "Your grandmother," he said eventually, "was Hester Vance." Cora blinked. "You knew her?" "Everyone around here knew her, one way or another." He said it carefully. Too carefully, though Cora didn't press. "Not yet. She kept a good household. Sharp mind. Sharper tongue when she needed it." "You sound like you liked her." "I sound," Ezra said, "like a man who's had a long enough day already, without wading into that particular river." Which wasn't an answer. Cora filed it away. "Will you help me?" she said. "With the vinegar. I'll pay what I can, which isn't much, but I don't want your money." He cut her off, not unkindly. "Wouldn't know what to do with it out here anyway." "Then what do you want?" He considered that, looked at her a long moment, weighing something Cora couldn't read. "Company, maybe," he said finally, like the admission cost him something. "It's been quiet out here a good long while. Longer than's good for a man." So it became a rhythm. Twice a week, sometimes 3, Cora riding out to the house past the mill, or Ezra, on his better days, walking the distance to her barn to check whatever batch she'd started since he last looked. He taught her things her grandmother's faded pencil notes never could have. "pH," he said, holding up a strip of paper she'd never seen before. "Tells you where the fermentation's at. Too high, you're still working alcohol. Too low, you've gone past vinegar, into something you don't want to drink." "How do I know what's right?" "You test it. Every batch. Every few days. You stop guessing and you start measuring." Cora wrote that down. Underlined it twice. "The mother," he told her another day, holding up a strange, pale, gelatinous mass floating in a jar of finished vinegar, "is the whole trick. Living culture. You keep a piece of it alive between batches, you seed the next one faster, cleaner, more consistent than starting from nothing every single time. It looks like something that crawled out of a swamp. It tastes like nothing until it doesn't. Then it tastes like everything." He set the jar down carefully, like it mattered to him more than he wanted to say. "Don't throw it away. Whatever else you do, don't throw the mother away." He taught her to filter through cheesecloth until the vinegar ran clear instead of muddy. Taught her the tart apples off older trees made a sharper, more complicated vinegar than the sweeter fruit off newer rows, which lined up, she realized with a small jolt, exactly with what Silas had told her about the older Thackeray trees. She started separating batches by variety after that. By week. By how far gone the fruit already was, when it hit her buckets. She kept the notebook filling, page after page, dates and numbers, and small careful notes in her own hand now instead of just her grandmother's ghost. It wasn't glamorous work. Most evenings meant standing in a cold barn, with a lantern, checking the same barrels she checked the night before, adjusting nothing, learning that most of this process was simply patience dressed up as labor. But somewhere in those pages, a system started to take shape. One that didn't depend on luck anymore. Batch 6 was the one that changed something. She tasted it off a spoon on a cold evening in early December, barn lit low, breath fogging, and went very still, the way you go still, when something surprises you enough to interrupt whatever you were bracing yourself to feel instead. Sharp. Bright. Faintly sweet underneath, the way a good apple always was, if you paid attention long enough to find it. Nothing like the harsh, muddy liquid of her earlier attempts. It tasted, unmistakably, like something a person could sell. Cora sat down hard on an overturned bucket, the same one, she realized distantly, she'd sat on the night the jug exploded, and just breathed for a minute. In. Out. Letting it land. 12 months had become closer to 10 by then, and for the first time, since Abernathy's narrow office, since the word forecloses, Cora let herself believe, just slightly, that 10 months might actually be enough. She rode to Ezra's the next morning, with a jar of it, practically before the sun was fully up. He tasted it. Didn't say anything at first. Just held it in his mouth a long moment, eyes closed, the way Cora imagined a man might taste something he hadn't expected to taste again. "Well," he said finally. "Well, what?" "Well, Mrs. Bennett." He opened his eyes, looked at her, with something that might have been the closest thing to pride a guarded old man allowed himself to show a near stranger. "I believe you've made vinegar." She gave the first proper batch away, before she ever sold a drop. Small jars, poured out to neighbors, to the widow who'd watched Ivy those long afternoons, to the woman, from church who'd once asked in that careful, pitying voice whether Cora had thought this through. She didn't charge anyone. Told herself it was, because she needed honest opinions, and not politeness bought, with a price tag. It was also, if she was honest, with herself, because giving something away, that had cost her this much, 10 weeks, for ruined batches, one exploded jug, every ounce of patience she had left, felt, strangely, like the only fair way to find out, if it was real. The feedback came back louder than she'd expected. Word moved through Thistledown the same way the mockery once had, except this time it carried something different underneath it. Curiosity, mostly. A little surprise. And then, on a gray December afternoon, a knock at her door, that changed the shape of things again. The man on her porch introduced himself, as Jasper Whitlock, owner of the town's only proper inn, broad-shouldered, flower on his sleeves, a look on his face like he'd walked the 3 miles out specifically to settle something. "Heard you made vinegar," he said, without much preamble. "I did." "Heard it's good." "I'd like to think so." "You got more?" Cora hesitated. The honest answer was no, not yet, not enough to sell, not with a shelf life she hadn't fully tested, and a system still more instinct than science. But she thought of 10 months. Of a clock that didn't care about honesty, when honesty meant standing still. "Not yet," she said. "But I will." Jasper studied her a moment. Nodded slowly, like that answer had satisfied something in him he hadn't been aware of testing. "My kitchen goes through more vinegar than you'd believe," he said. "Vinaigrettes. Pickling. The whole business runs on it, and what I've been buying comes dear, shipped in from Albany, half of it not worth the price." He glanced past her toward the barn, toward the mountain, that had shrunk considerably, but still sat there, patient, waiting to be turned into something. "You get to where you can supply steady, and steady means something I can build a standing order around. You come talk to me first. Before anybody else in this town gets the notion." Cora felt something rise in her chest, careful, guarded. She'd learned, this past year, not to let hope in too fast. But she let a little of it in anyway. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. Whitlock." "Wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Bennett." She scaled up, as fast as she reasonably could. Bought a dozen proper barrels, with money she genuinely couldn't spare, negotiated with Silas for a steadier, more sorted supply instead of the random weekly dump. Started treating the whole operation less like a widow's desperate experiment, and more like something that might actually survive contact with the real world. She even had a name for it by then, scrawled at the top of her ledger in her grandmother's old pencil hand copied out in her own. Vance Farm Vinegar. Because it wasn't hers alone. It never had been. It was Hester's sentence made into something you could put in a jar. which was around the time things started to go wrong in a way that had nothing to do with mold or seals or pressure building in an unwatched jug. It started small. A comment overheard at the general store secondhand, the way most bad news reached her these days. Somebody saying they'd heard the Bennett woman's barrels weren't clean. That there'd been sickness in a household that tried her vinegar. That maybe the town ought to look into it before more people got hurt. Cora hadn't heard of any sickness. Nobody could name a household, when she asked, gently, carefully, trying not to sound as alarmed as she felt. Because that's how rumors worked, she was learning. They didn't need a name. They just needed a direction to travel, and Thistledown, small as it was, gave them plenty of road. She rode into town the following week, and found Bartholomew Crane standing outside his store, watching her approach, with an expression that gave away exactly nothing and somehow gave away everything at once. "Mrs. Bennett, I hear congratulations are in order. Quite the little enterprise you've built. You've heard something else, too, I imagine. Rumors do travel." He said it lightly. Too lightly. Sickness is a serious word, though. Wouldn't want the town council to hear it, and not take it seriously. Cora felt the ground shift, slow and cold. "There is no sickness, Mr. Crane. I'm sure you're right." He smiled. That same smile, from the first day, the one that never reached anywhere near his eyes. "But I'm not the one you'll need to convince." The council inspector came out 3 days later. A thin, humorless man named Odell, who walked her barrels, with a clipboard, and a face that had already decided something, before he'd asked a single question. He found nothing wrong. Not really. A few notes about the barn's floor, small things Cora fixed, within the hour just to prove she could. But he left with a warning anyway. Formal. Written. Filed. "Any further complaint," Odell said, standing at the gate, "and we suspend your operation pending a fuller review. Could take months to clear. Could take longer. There's nothing to review, Mr. Odell. There's no sickness. There's no complaint, with a name attached to it." "There's a complaint," Odell said, unmoved. "That's enough to start the process. Whether it's true isn't my department to decide. It's the council's." He rode off. Left Cora at her own gate, 10 months, closer to 9 now, sitting on her chest like a stone she hadn't asked to swallow. She didn't need proof to know where the complaint had come from. She just needed to look at who benefited from a shuttered vinegar operation 3 miles outside town. Jasper Whitlock confirmed it a week later, in the low, careful voice of a man passing along something he probably shouldn't. "Crane's been talking to half the council," he said, leaning against her fence, hat pushed back. "Not loud about it. Quiet, the way he does everything. But I've heard enough pieces to put the shape together. He doesn't want competition on his shelf, Mrs. Bennett. Not from a woman, with a barn full of free apples undercutting what he's charged folks for imported bottles all these years. So he's trying to shut me down, before I'm even properly open. Looks that way." Cora stood a long moment, looking at her barrels, at the barn, at the whole fragile structure of a plan that Bartholomew Crane apparently thought he could knock over with a rumor and a clipboard. "He doesn't know me very well," she said quietly. Jasper almost smiled at that. "No," he said. "I don't suppose he does." She kept working. Kept the barn spotless enough that Odell, when he came back a second time, found nothing at all to write down. But the fear stayed, sat under her ribs alongside the mortgage clock, a second weight she hadn't asked to carry. Some nights, lying awake with Ivy's slow breathing drifting from the next room, Cora let herself feel the full size of it. Everything, she thought. One rumor. One man with a grudge, and a shelf full of vinegar he doesn't want undercut. And everything I've built could vanish, before I ever sell a single jar honestly. She didn't say any of it out loud. Not to Ezra, not to Silas, not to Jasper. She carried it quietly, alone, jaw set a little too tight for anyone to mistake it for calm. It was during this stretch, cold, tense, every knock at the door making her stomach drop, before she even knew who it was that Cora found the ledger. She'd been repairing a section of wall in the back pantry, boards gone soft, with rot, and behind the third board, tucked into a gap between the studs, she found a small tin box. Rusted shut. She had to work the lid free, with a knife. Inside, papers. A ledger, her grandmother's handwriting again, older than the recipe cards, the ink faded almost to nothing in places. And beneath the ledger, folded small, a letter read, and reread so many times the creases had worn soft as cloth. Cora sat down right there on the pantry floor and read. The ledger told a story she'd never heard. Hester Vance, decades earlier, had run a small vinegar operation of her own. Apples from her own trees, back before they'd gone wild and untended. A partner, the ledger named him only as B. C, who'd put up capital, arranged distribution, promised Hester a fair share of a growing, thriving little business. And then, according to the last entries, scrawled tighter and angrier, as the pages went on, had simply taken it. The capital. The distribution contracts. Even the recipe, in the end, copied out and carried off, before Hester ever realized what was happening. Left her with nothing. A debt from equipment she'd bought expecting a return, that never came. A public humiliation that had followed her, through thistledown for years afterward. The letter, when Cora finally unfolded it, was shorter. Simpler. Addressed to no one, the way people sometimes write letters they never intend to send. I built something, from nothing, and a man, with more comfort in his life than sense in his heart, decided it belonged to him instead. I will not do this again. I will keep what's mine small enough, that no one thinks it's worth stealing. Cora sat on the pantry floor a long time. Tin box open in her lap. Cold seeping up through the floorboards. B. C. Bartholomew Crane. She didn't know it for certain, not with proof solid enough to say out loud. But she felt it the way you feel weather changing, before the sky confirms it. The smug ease with which Crane had spoken to her that first day. This town has a certain rhythm. It's when people start reaching outside their trade that things tend to get complicated. He hadn't been talking about apples. He'd been talking about her grandmother. About a wound that hadn't finished healing on either side, decades later, waiting, patient, the way old wounds wait, for someone else to walk close enough to reopen it. She rode to Ezra's, that same evening, tin box wrapped in cloth in her lap the whole way, like something that might break, if she jostled it wrong. He read the ledger slower than she had. Read the letter slower still. When he finished, he set both down on his worn table, and was quiet, so long Cora thought he might not say anything at all. You knew, she said finally. Didn't you? That first day, when I asked if you knew her. You knew about this. Ezra didn't look up right away. I knew some of it, he said. Not the shape you've got in front of you now. Just the aftermath. The years after. Tell me. He was quiet another long moment. Then, slowly, like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried, so long he'd half forgotten the weight of it. I loved your grandmother once. Before any of this. Before Crane's father ever came around, with his fine talk and his contracts. Hester and I were close, once. And I let too much time pass, without saying anything about it, the way young fools do, and by the time I worked up the nerve, she'd already gone into business with a man who talked prettier than I ever could. Cora sat very still. He took everything from her, Ezra went on, voice rougher now. The business. The money. Nearly took her name along with it, the way rumor works in a town this size. She never fully recovered the trust of it. Never opened another operation, not properly, not after that. He looked at Cora then, eyes old and tired, unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. She used to say the same thing you told me she used to say. About the fruit not knowing its worth less. I always understood it, as more than a sentence about apples, Mrs. Bennett. I understood it, as the only way she'd found to keep believing something could still be worth saving. After a man convinced half this town she wasn't. Cora felt her throat tighten. Thought of the pencil-worn card in the recipe box. Thought of a grandmother she'd visited too rarely, dead now, who had carried this quietly for years, and never once let it show in the handful of visits Cora had actually made. Crane's father, she said slowly. Not Crane himself. His father, yes. Bartholomew was young then. Barely a man. Ezra shook his head. But he grew up watching his father get rich off another woman's ruin. Grew up in that store, inheriting shelves stocked partly on the back of what he took from Hester Vance. I'd wager he knows exactly whose granddaughter moved back onto that farm last year, Mrs. Bennett. I'd wager he's known since the day you arrived. Cora sat with that a long moment. The fire popped low. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was settling over the fields, the kind that meant real winter had finally arrived, and wasn't leaving any time soon. So this isn't about a rumor, she said quietly. This isn't about Vinegar at all, is it? No, Ezra said. I don't believe it ever was. She rode home slower than usual, that night, letting the horse pick its own pace, while her mind turned the whole thing over, again and again, trying to find some angle that made it smaller, less like a fight that had started before she was even born. 9 months. Give or take a week. A dead grandmother's stolen fortune. A dead grandmother's sentence, carried like a shield for 30 years, now sitting in Cora's own chest doing the same job it had always done. A man in a fine waistcoat who'd grown up rich on the wreckage of exactly the kind of thing Cora was trying, against every reasonable odd, to build back up out of a barn full of rejected apples. He's not going to stop, she thought. Whatever this is between us, it isn't new. It's just wearing my face this time instead of hers. She thought of Ivy, asleep at the neighbor's house. Thought of the tin box, sitting now on her own kitchen table, where her grandmother's pencil had once written the only inheritance that had actually mattered. I will not do this again, Hester had written. I will keep what's mine small enough that no one thinks it's worth stealing. Cora didn't agree with that part. Not anymore. Small hadn't saved Hester from the ache of it. Small had just made the loss quieter. I'm not going to keep it small, she thought, jaw setting hard in the cold night air. I'm going to make it big enough that stealing it costs him something he can't afford to lose either. She didn't know yet what that meant. But something had shifted in her that night. Something that had started, as fear was hardening, slowly, into something closer to resolve. The weeks that followed were steadier than Cora expected, given everything. Odell didn't return. Whatever pressure Crane had been applying seemed to have quieted, for the moment, though Cora didn't fool herself into thinking it was over. Just paused. She kept working. Kept the barn spotless. Kept the ledger filling, batch after batch, sorted now by variety, and week and every variable Ezra had taught her to track. She sold her first real order to Jasper the second week of January, a proper order, invoice, paid in coin instead of goodwill, and stood in his kitchen afterward, with the money folded in her hand, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could easily remember. Hope. Careful, guarded, small enough to fit in a closed fist. But hope. 9 months. She could do 9 months. She'd already survived worse in less time than that. The storm came at the end of January, the way storms in that part of the country tended to come, without much warning, considerably more violence than the sky's gray morning face had suggested. Cora heard it building, through the afternoon, a wind that kept shifting direction like it hadn't made up its mind, yet what kind of trouble it wanted to cause. By evening the trouble had decided. Rain first, hard and driving, turning within the hour to sleet, then something closer to hail, ice rattling the farmhouse windows in a rhythm that made Ivy startle awake, and crawl into her mother's bed, without asking, small and warm and frightened. It's all right, Cora told her, smoothing her hair back in the dark. It's just weather, sweetheart. It'll pass. It's loud, Mama. I know. I know it is. Cora didn't sleep. Lay there listening to the wind climb, thinking of the barn, of the barrels, of 9 months of work sitting exposed under a roof she'd patched, with more determination than skill. Around midnight, something in the storm's pitch changed. A sound like the sky tearing, followed almost immediately by a crash loud enough that Ivy screamed and clutched at her mother's nightdress with both small fists. Cora was up and moving before her mind had finished processing the sound. Threw a coat over her nightclothes. Grabbed the lantern. "Stay here," she told Ivy. "Stay in the bed. I'll be right back, I promise." Ivy's face, small and pale in the lantern light, didn't want to believe the promise. Cora didn't blame her. She went out into the storm anyway. The barn's east wall had come down. Not all of it, enough. Enough that the roof sagged inward at a dangerous angle, enough that rain and sleet poured directly onto the row of barrels she'd spent months building toward, enough that by the time her lantern light found the damage she already knew, with a sick certainty, exactly how bad it was. She waded in anyway. Grabbed at barrels. Tried to drag them clear, with hands shaking, from cold and fear in equal measure. One barrel tipped, split open against the wreckage, vinegar and pulp pouring, into mud that swallowed it instantly, weeks of careful work gone in a single wet, useless second. "No," Cora said out loud, to nobody, to the storm. "No, no, no." She kept working. Kept dragging what she could, into the barn's undamaged half, soaked through, hands numb, and somewhere in the middle of it she heard, faint under the wind, a sound that stopped her entirely. Ivy. Screaming. Not the startled scream of a child frightened by thunder. Something else. Something worse. Cora dropped the barrel she was holding. Didn't look back at what it cost her. Ran. Ivy was burning up. Cora found her tangled in the bedsheets, small body rigid, face flushed dark red, skin so hot to the touch, that for one horrible, suspended second Cora's mind went somewhere it hadn't let itself go in 2 years. Daniel. 11 days. This is how it starts. This is exactly how it starts. Ivy. Ivy, sweetheart, look at me. Ivy's eyes were open, but unfocused, glassy, fixed on something not in the room, lips moving with words that didn't quite form, breath coming too fast and too shallow. Cora had never in her life moved as fast as she moved in the next 10 minutes. Cool cloths. Water she barely remembered fetching. A blanket stripped away, because the heat coming off her daughter's body felt like something that shouldn't have been possible. And under the frantic motion of her hands, one thought ran on a loop she couldn't silence. Not her too. Please, not her too. I have already buried one person I love to a fever, and I cannot do it again. I cannot. I will not survive it twice. She thought distantly, wildly, of riding for the doctor. 3 miles into town, in this storm, in the dark, leaving Ivy alone in a house, with a barn half collapsed, and a fever climbing. She thought of the barrels still out there, exposed, ruining by the minute. And in that moment, cold water on her wrists, her daughter burning under her hands, the storm screaming outside like it had personal business with her, Cora Bennett made the only choice that had ever actually been a choice at all. She didn't go back to the barn. Not once. Not for a single barrel more. She stayed with Ivy, through the entire rest of the night, cloth after cloth, water after water, murmuring every soft, useless, desperate thing a frightened mother murmurs to a child too sick to hear most of it. Around 4 in the morning, the fever broke. Ivy's breathing evened. Her small body went slack, exhausted instead of rigid, sleep instead of delirium. Cora sat beside her the rest of the night anyway. Didn't move. Couldn't have, even if the barn itself had been on fire. Morning came gray and quiet, the storm finally spent, the world outside scoured raw and dripping. Cora left Ivy sleeping, properly sleeping now, color returned, breath slow and even, and walked out to the barn alone, still in the same soaked nightclothes, and coat she'd never changed out of. The damage was worse in daylight. The east wall was gone entirely, boards scattered across the mud, the roof above it collapsed inward, crushing almost everything beneath it. Barrels split open. Barrels swept into the wreckage and lost. Months of careful work reduced, in a single night, to ruin. Cora stood in the doorway a long time. Didn't cry. Couldn't, somehow, find the tears for it, exhausted past the point where crying still felt like the right response to anything. She just stood there, looking at what was left. 9 months, she thought, and the number felt suddenly, brutally small. 9 months, and this is what I've got to show for it. A collapsed barn. A handful of barrels I can't even count as a full inventory. And I chose right. I know I chose right. I would choose Ivy every single time, 1,000 times, without hesitation, but God help me. I don't know what I'd do now. She sat down on an overturned bucket and put her head in her hands. For the first time, since the letter from Abernathy's office had arrived, since the word forecloses first landed on her like a stone she hadn't asked to carry, Cora let herself think the thought she'd been holding off for months. Maybe I can't do this. Maybe this was always going to end here, no matter how hard I worked. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough her hands went fully numb. Long enough the gray morning light had shifted noticeably by the time she heard hooves on the lane. She didn't look up right away. Didn't have it in her. Mrs. Bennett. Ezra Marsh's voice, rough with the early hour, with the cold, with something else underneath that Cora couldn't identify, until he came around, into her line of sight, and she saw what he was carrying. A jar. Small. Careful in his hands like it held something precious. I heard about the storm, he said. Rode out soon, as the roads cleared enough to manage it. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett. I truly am. Cora looked past him at the collapsed wall, the wreckage still scattered across the mud. It's gone, she said, her voice flatter than she meant it, worn down past the point of dressing anything up. Most of it. 9 months, and it's just gone. Not all of it. She looked up at him then. At the jar. What is that? Mother Culture, Ezra said. From batch 6. The good one. I asked you for a portion of it back in December. Told you I wanted to study it, remember? Wasn't entirely honest about my reasons. I've been keeping her going. Feeding her. Small batches out at my place, just enough to keep the culture alive. Told myself it was for my own curiosity. Truth is, Mrs. Bennett, I'd buried enough things I loved watching go to waste in my life. I wasn't about to let this be another one. Not if there was anything I could do to stop it. Cora looked at the jar. At the pale, strange, living thing suspended inside it, the same thing that had looked, the first time he showed her, like something that had crawled out of a swamp. The thing he told her, that very first lesson, never to throw away. Whatever else you do, don't throw the mother away. She hadn't. He hadn't let her, even when she didn't know he was the one holding onto it. Something in Cora's chest, wound tight since she'd first seen the collapsed wall, loosened just slightly. Not fixed. Nothing about this morning was fixed. The barn was still in ruins. The barrels were still mostly lost. 9 months had not somehow become 10 just because an old man had shown up with a jar. But it wasn't nothing either. It was a start. A single, small, living start, held out in the cold morning light by a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much it cost to let something worth saving slip away unattended. Cora reached out. Took the jar in both hands. Held it like it weighed considerably more than it actually did. Thank you, she said, and her voice broke on the second word, finally, after a night that hadn't let her cry once. Ezra didn't say anything. Just nodded. Stood with her a moment longer in the wreckage of the barn, the gray morning light climbing, somewhere behind them a farmhouse, where a 5-year-old girl slept safe, and fevered no longer, and somewhere beyond that, unseen but never far, a clock that hadn't stopped ticking just because the night had been cruel. Not finished, Cora thought, looking down at the jar. Not yet. Whatever this is going to cost me, I am not finished. Spring came slow that year. Slower than Cora needed it to. She rebuilt the east wall herself, mostly. Silas sent Otis out for 2 days to help with the heaviest lifting, and Jasper Whitlock showed up unannounced one Saturday, with a wagon full of salvage lumber he swore he didn't have any use for, though Cora suspected otherwise, and didn't push the point. Because pride was a luxury. She'd learned that months ago. You didn't turn away help, when 8 months stood between you and losing everything your grandmother had left behind. 8 months. Then 7. The number kept shrinking whether the barn was fixed or not. She started over with a single jar. That was the whole of it, really, the mother culture Ezra had kept alive in secret, feeding it through the worst of winter, without telling her why, and now it sat on a shelf in a half-rebuilt barn like the smallest, most stubborn seed a person could plant. Cora fed it. Split it. Grew it slow across a handful of clean barrels, careful in a way she hadn't been careful the first time, because she couldn't afford to lose it twice. Patience, Ezra told her, more than once, standing over her shoulder, while she checked pH strips, with hands that still wanted to rush. You nearly lost her once already. Don't rush her back just to lose her again. I don't have time for patience, Mr. Marsh. You don't have time for anything else, he said. Not if you want this to work. She hated that he was right. She fed the mother anyway. Waited anyway. Because there wasn't another way, through it, and Cora had stopped looking for shortcuts the same week a jug blew its cap off 6 inches from her face. By April she had 4 barrels going steady. By May 8. Silas kept his word on the sorted fruit, tart drops, older trees, exactly the stock Ezra had taught her to want, and the rhythm settled into something almost peaceful. Tuesday deliveries. Wednesday crushing. The long, quiet stretch of waiting that used to terrify her now just felt like work. Honest work, the kind her hands understood even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. Jasper took his first full order the 2nd week of May. Paid on delivery, no haggling, and told 2 other innkeepers before the month was out, because that was simply how Jasper did business, loud and generous, incapable of keeping a good thing quiet even when quiet might have served him better. Word moved the way it always did in Thistledown, except this time it moved differently. Not mockery dressed up as concern. Just interest. Small at first. A farmer's wife stopping by to ask if the rumors about a widow selling proper vinegar were true. A specialty grocer 2 towns over sending a letter, careful and formal, asking for a sample. Cora sent it. Didn't expect much. 3 weeks later a standing order arrived by post, modest but real enough that she sat at her kitchen table that evening and cried for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not from grief. Not from fear. From something she'd almost forgotten the shape of. Relief. The people who'd laughed came back first, which struck Cora as almost funny in the bitter, private way things strike you funny when you've earned the right to find them so. Pruitt, who'd asked, half joking, whether she was burying something under the pile, rode out one August afternoon and bought 2 full jars, without a hint of the old amusement on his face. Paid cash. Tipped his hat on the way out. Didn't expect it to actually work, he admitted, standing at her gate. Neither did I, some mornings, Cora said. Glad one of us was wrong. He laughed at that. Genuine this time. Not at her. The woman from church who'd once asked, in that pitying voice, whether Cora had thought this through, came too, eventually, buying a jar for a niece's wedding favors, and saying nothing at all about the year prior. Didn't need to. Cora didn't bring it up either. She'd learned, somewhere in these 10 months, that she didn't need an apology from anyone. The shelf space said everything that needed saying. Which left only one person in Thistledown, who hadn't come around, and never would, and Cora knew exactly why. She saw Bartholomew Crane twice that summer. Once at the general store, buying salt she genuinely needed, and once at a distance, on the road, his fine carriage passing her wagon, without so much as a nod exchanged between them. Both times he watched her a beat too long. Both times Cora felt it, the particular, cold attention of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. She thought about the tin box sometimes. About the ledger, the initials, the letter folded soft with reading. She hadn't done anything with what she knew. hadn't confronted him, hadn't told anyone beyond Ezra, because what would it accomplish? A widow's word against a respected shopkeeper's, over a wrong done 30 years, before either of them had much say in anything. She let it sit. She should have known better. Crane wasn't the sort of man who let a debt, any kind of debt, simply sit unattended. The letter came in late August, delivered by Abernathy himself, which should have told her something, before she'd even broken the seal. Lawyers didn't ride 3 miles out for good news. Mrs. Bennett, he said, standing on her porch, hat in his hands, looking considerably more uncomfortable than the last time he delivered her difficult news. There's a matter regarding the mortgage. Cora's stomach dropped straight through the floorboards. What matter? The note has changed hands, Abernathy said carefully. Mr. Pemberton's bank sold the paper. Financial difficulties on the bank's end, nothing to do with you directly. But the debt itself, and the terms attached to it, now belong to a private holder. Who? Abernathy hesitated. Long enough that Cora already knew the answer, before he said it. Bartholomew Crane. The world tilted, just slightly, the way it had the day the first letter arrived announcing her grandmother's death. He bought my debt. He did. Perfectly legal. He's entitled to enforce the original terms. The October deadline stands exactly as written. But he's also entitled, now, to call the note early, if he can demonstrate cause. Missed payment. Property damage devaluing the collateral. Abernathy's eyes flicked briefly toward the rebuilt east wall of her barn, still lighter in color than the rest, still obviously new. I'd advise you to be careful, Mrs. Bennett. Very careful. About anything he might construe as cause. Cora stood on her own porch a long moment, the August heat pressing down heavy, and still, and felt something, that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite fury settle, into her chest instead. Something colder than either. He's not doing this for the money, she said slowly. No, Abernathy agreed. I don't imagine he is. She rode to Ezra's that same afternoon, faster than the heat really allowed, and found him in his garden, and didn't wait for pleasantries before she told him. He went very still. Set down the trowel in his hand like it had suddenly grown too heavy to hold. He knows, Ezra said quietly. He's known all along, exactly like I told you. And now he's decided the debt is a cleaner tool than a rumor. 2 months, Ezra. 2 months and he owns everything I built, if I can't pay it off outright, or if he finds one single thing to call cause. Can you pay it off? Cora thought of the ledger. The standing orders small but growing. The money set aside these past months, careful, hoarded, every spare coin funneled toward October instead of anything easier. Not all of it, she admitted. Not close to all of it. Not in 2 months. Ezra was quiet a long moment, looking out over his garden, over the low afternoon lights slanting gold, through the trees. Then we need more than money, he said finally. We need the truth. All of it. Out where the whole town can see it, not tucked away in a tin box behind your pantry wall. You mean tell people? About Hester? About what his father did to her? I mean, Ezra said, turning to look at her directly, something hard and decided in his face she hadn't seen from him before, that a man like Crane has spent 30 years building a name on his father's theft. Respectable. Trusted. Untouchable, in a town this size, because nobody's ever had the nerve, or the proof to say otherwise out loud. He picked the trowel back up. Set it down again. You have the proof, Mrs. Bennett. Sitting in a tin box. And you have something his father never had to contend with when he did the same thing to your grandmother. What's that? A town that's already tasted what you're capable of building. They laughed at you once. Now half of them are buying what you made. That's not nothing. That's leverage his father never had to worry about. Cora sat with that, felt the shape of something starting to form, not a plan yet, not quite, but the outline of one, the way batch one's failure had once been the outline of everything that came after. I need more than the ledger, she said slowly. I need him to say something. In front of people. Something he can't take back. Ezra almost smiled. Almost. Now, he said, you're thinking like your grandmother? She didn't rush it. Couldn't. 2 months wasn't enough time to be reckless, with the only card she had. She spent the first 2 weeks doing what she'd always done best. Working. Kept the barrels turning. Kept the standing orders filled, because whatever happened with the debt, whatever happened with Crane, the vinegar itself was the only real proof she had that any of this had ever been more than a widow's desperate gamble. But she also started asking questions. Careful ones. At the market, at church, anywhere old enough gossip might have settled into someone's memory, without them realizing its value. She found an old man named Purdy, who remembered Hester's operation from 30 years back, remembered specifically a young Bartholomew Crane's father showing up at gatherings bragging about a new venture that made him considerably richer within the space of a single year. She found a woman, older still, who recalled the exact season Hester Vance stopped attending market days altogether, and the exact season a young B.C. started stocking a general store with vinegar bottles nobody in town could quite explain the sudden supply of. None of it, alone, was proof. All of it together, laid alongside a ledger, with the initials B.C. written in a dead woman's careful hand, was something considerably harder to wave away. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't the one Cora had planned. She'd imagined something controlled. A private meeting, evidence laid out calm and deliberate, Crane backed into a corner, with no room to maneuver. Instead, it happened in his own store, on a crowded Saturday morning in mid-September, with half of Thistledown present to buy their weekly goods, and witness, entirely by accident, the exact moment Cora Bennett's patience finally ran out. She'd come in for salt. That was all. Truly all she'd intended. Except Crane was behind the counter. And Crane, seeing her, couldn't quite resist. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, pitched just loud enough to carry. "October's coming quick. I do hope your little venture is prepared for what's owed." Cora set her basket down slow. Looked at him across the counter, aware, distantly, of the store going quiet around them, of heads turning, of a Saturday crowd sensing something was about to happen, and settling in to watch it happen. "It'll be prepared, Mr. Crane. Will it? I understand barns can be unpredictable things. Walls fall down. Roofs cave in. Difficult to build toward a debt, when the foundation keeps giving out from under you." Something in Cora went very still. Very cold. "You seem awfully informed about my barn, Mr. Crane, for a man who's never once set foot on my property. A small town, Mrs. Bennett. News travels. Does it?" Cora reached into her satchel. Set the tin box on the counter between them, deliberate, unhurried, and watched, really watched, the way she'd once watched Daniel's face for the small signs that told her more than his words, as something flickered behind Bartholomew Crane's carefully arranged composure. Recognition. Fast. Gone almost as quick as it came. But not quick enough. "What," Crane said, voice tightening just slightly, "is that?" "My grandmother's ledger," Cora said. Loud enough now for the whole store to hear, and she didn't soften it, didn't apologize for the volume. "Hester Vance. 30 years back, before either of us was old enough to understand what we were watching, she built a vinegar operation not unlike mine. Had a partner. Capital, distribution, all arranged proper and fair on paper." She opened the box. Set the ledger down beside it, open to the pages thick, with faded, angry handwriting. Initials B.C. Mr. Crane. Man took the capital, the contracts, even the recipe, and left her, with nothing but debt, and a name this town spent years treating like a joke. The store had gone entirely silent. Cora could feel every eye in the room, could feel Crane's face working, through something he clearly hadn't rehearsed a response for. "I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Bennett." "I'm not implying anything." Cora's voice stayed level. Steady, the way she'd learned to keep it steady, over 11 days of Daniel's fever, over 2 years of grief afterward, over a year of exploding jugs, and gray mold, and a barn collapsing around barrels she'd nearly lost everything to save. I'm telling this town exactly what your father did to my grandmother. And I'm telling you, in front of every person standing in this store, that I know precisely why you bought my mortgage the moment my vinegar started selling well enough to remind you of it. This is absurd. Is it? Cora let that sit a beat. Let the silence do the work her words had started. Because I've spoken to people in this town old enough to remember exactly, when your father's shelves filled up, with a vinegar supply nobody could explain. Same season my grandmother's operation went quiet forever. Same initials, sir, written in her own hand 30 years before I ever had cause to open this box. Crane's face had gone a color Cora hadn't seen on him before. Not quite pale. Something closer to cornered. You have no proof of any wrongdoing, he said, and his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. A ledger. An old woman's grievance. That's not proof, Mrs. Bennett. That's a story. Maybe. Cora closed the tin box. Picked it back up, slow, deliberate, letting the whole room see her do it. But it's a story this entire town just heard, Mr. Crane. And I'd wager it travels considerably faster than any rumor you managed to spread about my barrels last winter. She turned. Walked toward the door, aware of every silent face she passed, aware that she'd just done something there was no taking back, something that might cost her everything, if it didn't land exactly right. At the door she stopped. Turned back one final time. You have until October to decide what kind of man you want this town to remember you as, she said. I already know what kind of woman my grandmother was, Mr. Crane. Whatever else your father managed to take from her, he never once managed to take that. She walked out. Didn't look back a second time. Behind her, the store stayed silent a long moment, before the whispers started, low and fast, and already spreading, exactly the way she'd known they would the second she'd decided to walk in, with that tin box instead of leaving it buried in her pantry wall. She half expected retaliation. Braced for it, the following days, jumping at every knock on her door, every unfamiliar rider on the county road. It never came. Not the way she'd feared. What came instead was quieter and stranger, and took her almost a full week to understand. People started talking. Not about her barrels this time. About Crane. About his father, dredged up now, from 30 years of comfortable silence, old-timers suddenly willing to say out loud what they'd apparently known, or half-known, or suspected all along, and never had reason to voice. Because that was the thing about a small town, Cora was learning. It didn't forget. It just waited, sometimes for decades, for someone brave enough, or desperate enough to hand it a reason to remember out loud. Crane's business, by the end of September, had gone noticeably quieter. Fewer customers through his door. Fewer nods on the street. Nothing dramatic, no mob, no formal accusation, nothing Cora could point to, and call justice exactly. Just a slow, steady erosion of the comfortable respectability he'd built his whole life on top of. The same kind of erosion, she suspected, that had once buried her grandmother's reputation, running now in the opposite direction, toward a man who'd spent 30 years assuming the debt would never come due. Which left, still, the actual debt. Hers. Real, and due, and sitting on the calendar, with the date, that didn't care one bit about reputations rising or falling. October the 14th. 11 days out by the time the whispers had finished doing their work, through town, and Cora still didn't have the full sum. Not close. She'd saved and sold, and scraped every corner of what the operation could reasonably produce in the time she had, and it still left a gap wide enough to lose the farm over. She sat at her kitchen table the night of October 3rd, ledger spread in front of her, doing the arithmetic one more time in case the numbers had somehow changed since the last 100 times she'd run them. They hadn't. I did everything right, she thought, staring at the gap between what she had and what she needed. I built it back from one jar. I told the truth in front of the whole town. And it still might not be enough. It still might not, she stopped herself. Pressed her palms flat against the table. No. Stop that. You have 11 days. 11 days is not nothing. 11 days is what you had in front of a jug that exploded 6 inches from your face, and you didn't quit then either. Ivy's voice drifted in, from the next room, 6 years old now, humming something tuneless to herself, before bed, and Cora sat a long moment just listening to it, letting it anchor her the way it always did, back to the only reason any of this had ever mattered in the first place. Jasper Whitlock showed up 2 days later, without being asked, and what he said changed the shape of everything that followed. Heard the numbers, he said, standing on her porch, hat in his hands, none of his usual booming cheer in his voice. Heard you're short. I'll manage, Mr. Whitlock. Maybe. He looked at her a long moment. Maybe not alone, though. What are you saying? I'm saying, Jasper said slowly, that a man doesn't build an inn in a town this size, without learning who's worth standing behind, when it matters. And I've been talking. To Pruitt. To the grocer 2 towns over. To half the folks who've bought a jar of your vinegar this past year, and tasted, for themselves, exactly what you built out of nothing, but a pile of apples nobody else wanted. Cora felt something catch in her throat. Jasper. Don't argue with me yet. Just listen. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable in the way of a man not used to saying something this earnest out loud. This town owes you an apology it's never going to know how to give properly. Not in words, anyway. But maybe it can give you something better than words come the 14th. If you'll let it. Cora didn't sleep well the nights that followed. Not from despair this time, from something closer to disbelief, watching a plan take shape around her that she hadn't built and couldn't fully control. Word moved through Thistledown one final time, before the deadline. Not gossip. Not mockery. Something else entirely, a collection, quiet and deliberate, passed hand to hand the way only a town small enough to know each other's business could manage. Coins from Pruitt. A contribution from the grocer 2 towns over, grateful for a supplier who never once let a standing order slip. Small amounts from families Cora barely knew by name, people who'd simply tasted something good, and remembered, when it mattered, exactly who'd made it. Even the woman from church came by, with a folded bill pressed into Cora's hand, and nothing more said than, for the niece's wedding vinegar. And a little besides. Cora tried to refuse it. All of it, at first some old, stubborn instinct that had gotten her, through 2 years of grief, and a full year of exploding jugs telling her she ought to manage this alone, the way she'd managed everything else. Ezra was the one who finally talked her out of it, sitting across from her at his worn kitchen table 3 days before the deadline. Your grandmother's mistake, he said carefully, wasn't trusting a partner. It was trusting the wrong one, and then deciding afterward that trusting anyone at all was the danger. He held her gaze steady the way he had that first day she knocked on his door, with nothing but questions, and a mountain of rotting apples behind her. This isn't Crane's father come around again, Mrs. Bennett. This is a town that watched you build something real out of nothing, and wants a chance to make sure it doesn't disappear, over a debt that was never really about money in the first place. Cora sat with that a long moment. She kept it small, she said quietly. So nothing could be stolen from her again. And you built it big enough, Ezra said, that an entire town decided it was worth protecting instead. October the 14th arrived cold and clear, the kind of bright autumn morning that felt almost cruelly indifferent to everything riding on it. The auction was set for noon, on the courthouse steps in the center of Thistledown, Abernathy presiding with a stack of papers, and a face that gave away nothing about which way he expected the morning to go. Cora arrived early. Ivy's hand in hers, 6 years old now, dressed in her good coat, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense the weight of it in the way her mother's hand gripped hers a little too tight. Bartholomew Crane arrived not long after. Alone, notably, no lawyer at his side this time, no easy confidence in his walk. He'd lost weight, Cora noticed. Lost, too, some of the smooth, unbothered certainty that had once made his smile so unsettling. He looked, standing on those courthouse steps, like a man who'd finally understood the debt he was calling and might not be the only one coming due that morning. The crowd that gathered surprised even Cora. Not the handful of curious onlookers she'd braced for. Half the town, it seemed, Pruitt, the grocer, the woman from church, Silas Price standing near the back, with his hat against his chest exactly like he had, that first Tuesday at her gate, Jasper Whitlock front and center with an expression that dared anyone present to object to what was about to happen. Abernathy read the terms aloud, formal and dry, the exact wording of the note Hester Vance had signed years before any of them had cause to care about it. The balance owed. The deadline, met precisely to the day. The consequence, should the sum not be produced in full. The debt stands at $420, Abernathy said, voice carrying clean across the crowd. Payable in full, this day, or the property reverts to the note's holder, Mr. Bartholomew Crane, effective immediately. Silence. Cora felt every second of it, standing there with Ivy's hand in hers, the whole weight of 14 months, a whole year, and more, since the day this had all started, with a letter and a narrow office smelling of pipe smoke. I have, she started, voice steadier than she felt, $260 saved from the operation. I believe, Jasper Whitlock said, stepping forward before she'd even finished, the rest is accounted for. He held up a leather pouch, heavier than it looked. Behind him, Pruitt stepped forward too. Then the grocer. Then a dozen faces Cora recognized, and a handful she didn't, each adding something, coins and folded bills passed hand to hand, until Abernathy stood counting a sum that climbed steadily past what was needed. Cora stood frozen, through the entire count, Ivy's small hand still gripped in hers, watching a year of mockery, and rotten apples, and exploding jugs, and a collapsed barn wall resolve itself into a town's quiet, deliberate act of paying her back for something she never once asked to be repaid. $435, Abernathy announced finally, looking up from the count. The debt is settled. With a surplus, Mrs. Bennett, which I believe the contributors intended, as a gesture beyond the mortgage itself. Cora couldn't speak. Stood there, throat closed tight, looking out at faces that had once slowed their wagons just to gawk at a rotting pile of apples, and now stood, a year later, refusing to let her lose the thing she'd built out of it. Bartholomew Crane stood at the edge of the crowd, alone, watching the sum get counted, with an expression Cora would remember a long time afterward. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to a man watching, in real time, the last comfortable certainty of his life quietly dissolve in front of him. He didn't say anything. Turned. Walked away without waiting for the formal paperwork, without a word to anyone, and Cora watched him go, with something that surprised her. Not triumph. Just a kind of tired, settled peace. You didn't take it, she thought, watching his back retreat down the road. You didn't take it from her, and you didn't take it from me either. Whatever your father managed to steal 30 years ago, it stops here. Ezra found her afterward, standing off to the side of the dispersing crowd, and pressed something small into her hand before she'd even registered him approaching. A jar. Small. The pale, strange, living mother culture suspended inside it, the same kind he'd carried out to her in the wreckage of the barn the morning after the storm. For the next batch, he said simply. Every batch from here on. She started this whole business, Mrs. Bennett, long before either of us knew what we were building. Seemed fitting she should keep going too. Cora held the jar a long moment, throat still tight, Ivy tugging gently at her other hand, impatient in the way of children who've stood still, through too many important adult things already. Thank you, Cora said. For all of it. I don't think I'd have made it through the winter without you. Ezra looked at her a moment. Something old and careful in his face, 30 years of quiet regret finally, visibly, starting to loosen its grip. Your grandmother would be proud of you, he said. I mean that plainly, Mrs. Bennett. Whatever she lost, all those years back, I think she'd say you found it again. Better than she ever managed to herself. Winter of 1882 tried to kill the whole operation twice. Nearly succeeded once. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about surviving a disaster. It doesn't mean the disasters stop coming. It just means you've got a little more practice standing back up when they do. The first blow came in January. A hard freeze that settled in and refused to lift for 11 straight days, and Cora woke one morning to find 3 of her newest barrels cracked clean through, the liquid inside frozen solid enough to split good oak like kindling. She stood in the barn doorway that morning and didn't cry. Didn't scream either, the way she might have a year earlier. Just looked at the damage, breathed out slow, and said, mostly to herself, "All right." All right? Not that one again. She'd already learned the lesson the storm tried to teach her. You don't fall apart over what's already broken. You just figure out what's still standing, and you work from there. What was still standing was 5 barrels. A year earlier, a fifth of her stock would have felt like the whole world ending. Now it just felt like weather. The second blow came in March, and this one had a face attached to it. A man named Reeves showed up at her gate one gray afternoon, driving a fine wagon loaded with barrels of his own, introducing himself as a distributor working out of Albany. Said he'd heard about Vance Farm Vinegar. Said he had connections that could put her bottles in front of 5 times the customers she currently reached. Cora should have been thrilled. Mostly, she was suspicious. Because good news that showed up unannounced at her gate had a poor track record so far in her life. What's the catch, Mr. Reeves? No catch, Mrs. Bennett. Simple arrangement. I take a percentage of every case I move for you. You get access to markets you couldn't reach selling out of a farm wagon. What percentage? He told her. Cora did the arithmetic in her head, fast, the way she'd learned to do arithmetic on everything now. The number was too high. Not criminally so. Just high enough that a woman still rebuilding from a near foreclosure couldn't afford to hand away that much of her margin. I'll need to think on it, she said. Don't think too long, Mrs. Bennett. Opportunities like this don't sit on a shelf waiting. She talked it through with Ezra that evening, and he listened the whole way through before saying a single word. What's your instinct telling you? He asked finally. My instinct's telling me the man drove 3 hours out of his way for a percentage that big. Which means he sees something in this operation worth that drive. Which means maybe I don't need him as much as he wants me to think I do. Ezra almost smiled at that. Your grandmother, he said, would have said the exact same thing. Word for word, near enough. Is that good or bad? Depends, Ezra said, on whether you're planning to end up the same way she did. Cora sat with that. I'm not going in blind, she said slowly. That was her mistake, not mine. I'm going to write it down. Every term. Everything he owes me, and everything I owe him, on paper, signed by both of us, witnessed by Abernathy himself. And if he balks at that, then he wasn't offering a partnership in the first place. He was offering a trap, with better manners than Crane's. Reeves balked hard at first. Came back 3 weeks later with better terms. Signed this time, witnessed, exactly the way she'd asked. Because that was the other thing Cora had learned this past year, sitting through every failure, and every small hard-won victory. Patience wasn't just for Vinegar. It worked on people too, if you had the nerve to hold your ground long enough to let it. By the summer of 1883, Vance Farm Vinegar had crossed into Albany, into 2 counties beyond that, and Cora had hired a second employee, a quiet, capable woman named Delphine who'd lost her own husband to a mill accident the year before and understood, without needing it explained, exactly what it meant to build something out of the wreckage of everything you'd expected your life to look like instead. The two of them worked well together. Better than well. Some mornings, crushing apples side by side in a barn that no longer felt like the site of any disaster at all, Cora caught herself thinking that this exact life, this exact rhythm, was one she wouldn't have traded even if someone had offered her back the version of things where Daniel never got sick, where none of this ever had to happen at all. She never said that thought out loud. Some thoughts you just carried quiet, the way her grandmother had carried hers for 30 years. Silas Price kept coming Tuesdays. Every single one, rain or frost, or high summer heat, even after Thackeray's blight cleared, and the orchard no longer needed quite so badly to unload its rejects on somebody else's land. Cora noticed that. Filed it away the way she filed away most things worth noticing. "You don't have to keep bringing loads out here, Mr. Price," she told him once, standing at the fence the way they had, that very first morning, years back now. Thackeray's recovered. "You could sell what you used to dump on me." Silas considered that a long moment. Looked at the barn behind her, at the barrels, through the open doors, rows of them now, more than either of them could have imagined, that first Tuesday. "Could," he agreed. "Choose not to." "Why?" "Because you built something worth being part of, Mrs. Bennett." He said it plain, no dressing on it. "And because I'd rather be the man who brought you the apples that made it possible than the man who decided, once it stopped being charity, that he had better uses for his fruit." Cora looked at him a long moment. Something warm settling in her chest she didn't examine too closely. "Well," she said finally, "I'm glad you feel that way, Mr. Price." "So am I, Mrs. Bennett." A pause. "So am I." Neither of them said anything else about it. Not that day. Ezra's health began its slow decline the winter of 1884. Nothing dramatic. Just a cough that lingered longer than a cough should. A slowness in his step that hadn't been there the year before. Cora noticed it the way you notice a season changing, gradual, and then, one day, undeniable. She started riding out to check on him more than the vinegar strictly required. Brought him soup some evenings, sat with him by his fire, let the conversation drift wherever it wanted to instead of always circling back to pH, and barrels and mothers kept carefully alive. It was on one of those evenings, deep in the winter of 1885, fire burned low, wind pressing against the windows, that Ezra finally told her the rest of it. The part about Hester he'd always held back. "I asked her once," he said, voice rougher than usual, "before Crane's father ever came sniffing around, with his contracts. Asked her to marry me?" Cora sat very still. "What did she say?" "Said yes." Ezra almost laughed, the sound catching rough in his chest. "Can you imagine that, Mrs. Bennett? 30-some years I've been telling myself I lost my nerve too late." "Truth is I didn't lose my nerve at all." I asked. She said yes. "Then what happened?" Ezra was quiet a long moment. The fire popped low. "Her father happened," he said finally. "Old man Vance never thought much of me. Thought I was too poor, too plain, not enough ambition in me to keep a wife the way he figured a wife ought to be kept. Forbade it, outright. And Hester," he stopped, started again. "Hester loved her father more than she let on to anyone, including me. She didn't defy him. Not for that. Married someone else eventually, someone her father approved of, and by the time that marriage ended in widowhood, same as yours did, Mrs. Bennett, and by the time she might have come looking for me again, you'd stopped waiting." "I'd stopped waiting," Ezra confirmed, quiet. "Told myself it was too late. Told myself a lot of things, that decade. And then Crane's father came along not long after, talked her into the Vinegar partnership, and I watched the whole thing collapse, from a distance, too proud and too hurt to offer help I wasn't sure she'd even want from me anymore." Cora felt something ache in her chest, deep and old, a grief that wasn't even hers by rights, and still landed heavy anyway. "You loved her the whole time," she said softly. "The whole time," Ezra agreed. "Every year of it. Right up until the day she died, and past that day too, if I'm honest, which I don't often let myself be." He looked at Cora, eyes wet in the firelight, something in his face entirely unguarded, the way it so rarely was. "You want to know the real reason I kept that mother culture alive, through the worst of that storm, Mrs. Bennett? Wasn't kindness. Wasn't even really about you, not at first. Then what was it? It was the only piece of her I ever got the chance to actually save," Ezra said. 30 years too late to save the rest. I wasn't about to let this go too. Cora reached across the small distance between their chairs, and took his hand. Held it a long moment, saying nothing, because some grief doesn't need words laid over it. It just needs somebody willing to sit beside it a while. Ezra Marsh died in his sleep in the early spring of 1886, 3 weeks after Ivy's 11th birthday, quiet and unremarkable the way he'd have wanted it, according to Delphine, who found him, when he failed to answer his door 2 mornings running. Cora rode out that same hour. Sat with him along, while before anyone else arrived, the fire long gone cold in his hearth, and found, on the kitchen table beside him, a small jar. The mother culture. Fed, tended, alive right up until the last evening of his life. She took the jar home with her. Didn't ask anyone's permission. Didn't think anyone would have denied her anyway. The whole town turned out for the burial, which surprised Cora less than it might have a few years earlier. Ezra had kept to himself for decades, true enough, but a man who'd quietly taught half the county's failing enterprises how to survive their own mistakes didn't stay a stranger forever, not once people finally had cause to notice him. Cora buried him beside her grandmother. Hadn't needed to ask anyone's permission for that either. The land beside Hester's stone had simply always felt, somehow, like it was waiting for exactly this. She stood at the twin graves along, while afterward, Ivy's hand in hers, the spring wind moving soft through the orchard rows beyond the fence. They loved each other, Cora said quietly, mostly to herself. The whole time. Just never got the chance to say so out loud, when it might have mattered. Ivy looked up at her, 11 years old, sharper than her age most days. That's sad, Mama? It is, Cora agreed. It's also not nothing, sweetheart. Sometimes love doesn't get to end up the way you choose for it. Doesn't mean it wasn't real. Doesn't mean it didn't matter. She squeezed Ivy's hand. He kept a piece of her alive for 30 years, without anyone asking him to. That's a kind of ending too. Just a quieter one than most people get. Cora dedicated a small plot beside the barn to Ezra that summer. Planted a single apple tree there, a tart old variety he'd always favored, the kind that made the sharpest, most complicated vinegar of anything she'd ever produced. She labeled the next batch made, from its cousins in his honor, Marsh's Reserve. Sharper than the standard line, priced a little higher, sold out within a month of its first appearance on Jasper Whitlock's shelf. People asked her about the name sometimes. She told them the truth, the parts of it that were hers to tell. A man who taught a desperate widow everything she knew, and asked for nothing in return, but company in a house that had gone too quiet for too long. She never told the part about Hester. That part felt like it belonged to the two of them alone, buried now side by side under the same spring wind, finally, after 30 years, close enough to keep each other company properly. Silas found her in the orchard one evening, that same summer, standing near the 2 graves, with a jar of the season's first batch in her hand, and didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside her, quiet, the way he'd learned to be quiet around grief, without needing to fill it up with words. "You've had a hard few years, Mrs. Bennett," he said eventually. "I have. You've also built something not many people manage to build in a lifetime. Let alone 6. Cora looked over at him. At the weathered face she'd known for 6 years now, the same steady presence every single Tuesday, since the first cart rolled up her lane. "You've been part of that, Mr. Price. I don't say it often enough. I should." "You don't need to say it," Silas said. "I've known it a while now." They stood a moment longer in the fading light. Cora felt something shift, quiet and unhurried, the way most true things in her life had shifted, since the day this whole story started. Not a dramatic turn. Just a small, steady recognition of something that had been growing for years, without either of them naming it out loud. "Silas," she said finally, testing the name, without its formal weight for the first time in 6 years. He turned. Looked at her properly, something careful and hopeful crossing his weathered face. "Cora," he answered, just as careful, just as deliberate, and neither of them said anything else that evening. They didn't need to. Some things, Cora was learning, were better left to grow slow and steady, the way everything worth having in this life seemed to grow. No rushing it. No forcing an ending before its season arrived. By the autumn of 1887, Vance Farm Vinegar employed 4 people full-time, supplied standing orders across 4 counties, and had, quietly, without any formal announcement, become something like a fixture of Thistledown's identity, the strange, stubborn success story people told newcomers about, usually starting with the words, "You should have seen the pile of apples she started with." Bartholomew Crane's store had changed hands twice by then. Cora heard he'd moved on to Albany eventually, chasing some other venture, some other town, that hadn't yet learned to remember what he carried with him. She didn't think about him much anymore. There wasn't room for it. There was too much else. Ivy was 12, that October, tall for her age, sharp-eyed, with her father's quiet patience, and her mother's stubborn refusal to leave a problem unsolved. She spent most afternoons, after school, out in the barn, perched on the same overturned bucket her mother had once sat on the night a jug exploded 6 inches from her face, a small notebook open on her knees. Cora found her there one evening, the light going gold, and low the way it always did this time of year, and stood a moment in the doorway just watching. Ivy was testing pH strips. Careful, methodical, exactly the way Ezra had once taught her mother, dipping the strip, checking the color, writing the number down in neat, careful figures beneath a column labeled Batch 22. "How's it reading?" Cora asked, stepping in. Ivy didn't look up right away, focused entirely on the strip in her hand. "Still working the alcohol," she said. "Not ready yet." "You sound very sure of that." "I am sure of that." Ivy finally looked up, something of her mother's old stubbornness flashing bright in her eyes. "You taught me that, Mama. You don't rush her. Whatever else you do." Cora felt something rise in her chest, warm and sudden, and almost too full to hold steady. "Don't rush her back just to lose her again," Ezra had said once, standing over her shoulder in a barn that had nearly collapsed the winter before. She'd carried that sentence for years now. It seemed, watching her daughter write careful numbers into a notebook of her own, that the sentence had found its way to carrying itself forward without her. "No," Cora said softly. "I suppose you don't." She sat down on the bucket beside her daughter, picked up a second pH strip, tested it herself, the motion so familiar by now it barely required thought at all. Outside, past the barn doors, the light kept sinking gold, and low across 11 acres, that had once been nothing but wild grass, and a rusted cider press nobody expected to turn again. It turned now. Every season. Every Tuesday, without fail, a rhythm as steady and certain as anything Cora Bennett had ever built in her life. She thought, on evenings like this one, of the sentence that had started all of it, a grandmother's voice, worn soft by years of not being heard, resurfacing at exactly the moment it was needed most. "The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less." People decided that. Nature never did. Cora had spent a year proving that sentence true, with her own 2 hands. Had spent the years since making certain it never got forgotten again, not by this town, not by her daughter, not by anyone who ever slowed their wagon along the county road, and wondered, for a moment, what exactly they were looking at. A mountain of rejected apples. A widow with nothing but a pencil-worn recipe card, and a debt she refused to let define her. An old man who spent 30 years believing he'd lost his chance at love, and spent the last of his strength saving a small jar of it anyway. A grandmother who'd been robbed once, and rebuilt her whole philosophy around a single sentence instead of letting bitterness win the argument. And now, a barn that still turned every season, filled with the next generation already learning, patient number by patient number, exactly what could grow out of the things everyone else had already decided to throw away. Worth wasn't something the world got to decide alone. Not for apples. Not for people either. Somewhere down the county road, come the next autumn, another cart would roll up to somebody else's gate, loaded with something everyone else had already agreed to call worthless. Most people would still just watch it pass by. But not all of them. Not anymore. Not in a town that had already learned, once, exactly what could grow out of the things nobody else thought were worth saving.